Hi, I'm Ashley Bischoff, and I'm going to be talking to you today about ergonomics. I work with the Paciello Group as an accessibility analyst and copy editor. And before we get into ergonomics itself, I thought I would cover just a quick disclaimer. Namely, this is an issue that affects me personally, and I've done a lot of research on this, but at the same time, I am not a doctor. And if you have pains in your hands or wrists, you should go see a doctor. With that being said, I thought we'd start off with my story and how I got into ergonomics. Now, in my case, I actually started noticing some aches in my wrists back in college. And for me, college was about 20 years ago. Of course, at the time, I had plans to get into a career in computing, and I realized that, that's not going to be really compatible with having aches and pains in my wrists. So at that point, I went to the campus health center to get things checked out. So from there, the doctor asked me some questions, and he looked over my hands and wrists. And sure enough, I had some of the early signs of repetitive strain injury. So from there, I went back to my dorm room and I started researching ergonomics. And, I really put a lot of thought into this because I couldn't have these problems preventing me from getting into what I wanted to do for a living. Because I wanted to be able to work in a career in computing for quite some time. So before we actually get into ergonomics, I thought we'd talk first a bit about Helvetica. But don't worry, this will all come together. So Helvetica, you might be wondering, what is Helvetica? And it is a sans serif typeface, and it was developed in Switzerland in 1957 for the type foundry Linotype. And it was so named because Helvetica means Switzerland in Latin. And if you might not be familiar with what Helvetica looks like, it's actually that second paragraph right there. That's said in Helvetica. And I'm guessing there's probably a pretty good chance that you've come across Helvetica. And speaking of typefaces you come across, you've probably also heard of a typeface called Arial, which in some ways may seem a bit like Helvetica. But to get into how Helvetica fits in with Arial, we first need to go into a bit more history just briefly about Helvetica itself. So Helvetica picked up steam throughout the 60s, and it continued to be a big seller for Linotype. And Monotype, which is a competing type foundry, they needed something to scratch that itch. So in 1982, Monotype developed Arial, which was a knockoff of Helvetica. And you can tell that Arial is a knockoff and not merely a typeface in a similar style because each of Arial's letters has the exact same proportions as the corresponding letter in Helvetica. Now, just to help illustrate what that means, here is that same set of text again, but in this case, while the top one is said in Helvetica, the bottom one is said in Arial. And so you can kind of see how each of the corresponding letters, for example, the C in Helvetica versus the C in Arial, and so on, they are the exact same width. Not only that, but as you may notice, the words even end up with the same line breaks. And that's because Arial really is just a clone of Helvetica. Now, before we get into this too far, you might be wondering, okay, well, what's the difference between a font and a typeface anyway? Since you may have heard me mention these terms a couple of times. And as that goes, Here's one analogy that may help a bit when it comes to the difference between a font and a typeface. So you might think of it this way. So an MP3 is to a song as a font is to a typeface. So that is to say that in the same way that an MP3 is what's on your hard drive and a song is what you listen to, a font is what's on your hard drive and a typeface is what you see. So with that part out of the way, you might be wondering, okay, is there really that much of a difference between Helvetica and Arial anyway? And you might think of it this way. So let's just imagine that you are hosting the next US president for brunch, whoever that might be. And, would you offer them a Coke? Or would you think that Safeway Cola would be fine? Because when it comes to typefaces, Helvetica is real Coke. Now, just as a quick sidebar, you may have also noticed that weird sort of square barcode type thing up in the corner. That happens to be a QR code, which is basically a barcode but in a square. And if you take your phone and you open up the camera app, and then you point it at the screen, you should see a little banner at the top saying, hey, do you want to open this URL? So really, in this case, the QR code is just a way of conveniently conveying URLs throughout the talk. So that way you don't have to type them in. Anyhow, moving on from there, you may be wondering, okay, so how can I tell the difference between Helvetica and Arial? And to answer that, we first have to cover just a couple of typography terms. And don't worry, it's really just two terms here. So the first of which is the idea of the baseline. And the baseline is the invisible line that letters sit on. So in this example here, you can see how there are the letters like A, B, C, and so on. And they're sitting on what in this case is an illustrated red line. That represents the baseline that the letters sit on. Another term that's relevant here is the idea of a terminal. And the terminal represents the end point of any stroke of a letter. So for example, here we have the endpoints of the C that kind of come together like this. So each of those would be a terminal. Or for example, there's the letter E or the letter S. And likewise, the endpoints of those represent terminals. So with that knowledge in hand, here's a rule of thumb for how you can tell Arial and Helvetica apart. So as perhaps you can see, there's Helvetica on top, and we have Arial on the bottom. And it so happens that every one of Helvetica's terminals is either parallel or perpendicular to the baseline. So here's what that looks like in practice. So you can see, for example, on the letter C, the two endpoints come together and they are perfectly parallel not only to each other, but also to the baseline, the invisible line that the letters sit on. Or you might have, for example, the letter T, and on Helvetica, the top of the letter T is just perfectly flat and parallel with the baseline. Or like with the letter R, you can see how its terminal at the end is perfectly straight up and down. But then, in contrast with Arial, its terminals are just all higgledy-piggledy to the baseline. So you've got, for instance, Arial C, where instead of coming together to a nice parallel form, they just kind of almost get there, but not quite. Or with Arial's T, you can see how it's got kind of a slant to it. Or likewise with Arial's R, that's kind of a bit of bend to it. And of course, monotype made these modifications so as to avoid copyright infringement from Helvetica. But it's sort of a bit like if someone wanted to avoid copyright infringement for a recipe, and so they just add an extra cup of salt to the dish. And of course, that ends up ruining it. And accordingly, with Arial, they took a perfectly good typeface like Helvetica, and they kind of ruined it. But even if you set aside the terminals and so on, there's actually another tip I can share for telling them apart. Namely that Arial also has a few glyphs that particularly stand out like sore thumbs against Helvetica's counterparts. One of those such glyphs is the letter 1, and with Helvetica's 1, I think it looks kind of regal. I mean, maybe almost stately. But then in contrast, you get to Arial's 1, which kind of just end up with a bit of a cowlick. Or, for instance, if you take Helvetica's B as a starting point, you can see how Helvetica's R gracefully takes the baton of the design language to incorporate those same curves and arcs into its R. While in contrast, if you take Arial's B, you can see that its R just doesn't take a baton of anything. And Arial's R just ends up with a bit of a case of manspreading. But all right, so at this point I thought, hey, let's just try a type sample or two just to kind of see how this works out in practice. So, for instance, here's the word style. And for those of you playing along at home, does this look more to you like Arial? Or does this look more to you like Helvetica? And I'll give you just a moment to kind of think about which one it might be for a moment. So if you were thinking to yourself, you know, this looks a bit more like Arial to me, you would be correct. And you can see, for instance, how on the top of the T, it's got that weird cut-off top to it. Or likewise, the terminals on the letter E kind of curve upward, but don't quite make it to being parallel with the baseline. But all right, let's maybe try another one. So here's the word target. And when you look at that, does that perhaps resemble more Arial to you or maybe more Helvetica to you? And I'll give you just a moment to kind of think about that for a sec. So from this point, if you were thinking to yourself, you know, that looks a bit more like Helvetica, you would be correct. And you can see how, for instance, the top of the T has a nice flat part to it that's parallel with the baseline. Or, for instance, even the terminals on the A with the E are also likewise perfectly parallel to the baseline. So all in all, yeah, Arial, they've kind of cut some corners. But, you know, just to be fair, it's not as if that makes it the worst typeface in the world. But at the same time, I don't want to leave you hanging. So, you know, if you might be curious about the worst typefaces out there, I mean, it turns out that Arial's only like third worst. So in all, I mean, like I was saying, it's not the worst typeface out there. That, in fact, there are at least two typefaces who are maybe just a slightly bit worse than Arial. And from here, you might be wondering, well, okay, so how does all of this relate to ergonomics? And really, what it comes down to is neutrality. So that is to say that the human body really isn't designed to do any one task for hours and hours at a time. But we can reduce that strain by keeping our working posture in as neutral a position as possible. So, in our own way, that means keeping our terminals either parallel or perpendicular to the baseline. So in this metaphor, the terminals would be things like our hands or our legs and other appendages. And the baseline would be, in this case, the floor. So that brings us to Helvetica Win Part 1, which is that when you're typing at your desk, your thighs should be parallel to the floor. And hopefully that's fairly self-explanatory. And likewise, we come to Helvetica Win Part 2, which is that when you're typing, your knees should be at right angles. And if you might not be aware, a right angle refers to a 90-degree angle. So like with my arm here, this would be a right angle. As well, we come to Helvetica Win Part 3, which is that when you're typing, your elbows should also be at right angles. And as well, we also get Helvetica Win Part 4, which is that when you're typing, your forearms, which are these parts of your arms, your forearms should be parallel to the floor. Now, unfortunately, that brings us to The Patriarchy Sucks Part 1, which is that almost all desks are designed for 6-foot-tall men, or if you're using metric, about 2-meter-tall men. So what that means is that your current desk almost certainly places your keyboard far too high for you to be able to type with your forearms parallel to the floor. In fact, if perhaps you're at your desk right now, you might just look down and see what sort of angle you have with your hands. So for example, I would venture to guess you probably have kind of a shallow angle in your elbow here because your desk is a bit too high. And from here, this also brings us to The Patriarchy Sucks Part 2, which is that almost all desks are about 30 inches high, which is too high for most anyone who isn't 6 foot tall. And I know this because I actually went to Staples, which is an office supply store here in the States, and I measured the desks. And sure enough, yeah, they're all basically right at 30 inches. But all is not lost, because there are a couple of techniques that you can use to fix your desk height. One such option is that you can use a footrest or a box to place your feet on, and then in turn that may make it more feasible to raise your chair height. So that's one option that can help. Another option out there is that you could potentially try an adjustable height standing desk. Now, this may seem like a bit of an odd suggestion here in this context, but as it happens, one of the best features about adjustable height standing desks is that almost all of them can be lowered below 30 inches, or in metric, 76 centimeters. So that's another option that's out there for you. So from here I thought, okay, you know what, let's just try a thing. Let's try a little exercise to demonstrate another principle here. So we've all seen zombie movies, right? So without bumping into others, if you may be watching this at an office or the like, try extending your arms in front of you like you were a zombie, like one of these. And then from there, as you take on this posture, imagine that the zombie pose, this one, is actually a pretty great starting point for some rules of thumb about your forearms when you're typing. The first of which is that your forearms are parallel to each other when you're doing the zombie pose. And as well, your hands take on the handshake position. Now you may be wondering, okay, what is this handshake position? And to show you what I mean, try this. So leaving your arms extended, try rotating your wrists so that your palms perfectly face the floor, if you're able to. Now, as you're doing that, just try to hold that for a moment. When you're holding that position for a few seconds, you may start to feel some strain along your inner forearms. And the reason for that is that the position for our hands, the neutral position for our hands, isn't to be perfectly flat. So in this case, that's where the handshake position comes into play, where if you imagine that you're about to shake someone's hand, your hands are kind of a bit of at an angle, and that is what I refer to as the handshake position. And this represents sort of a neutral posture for our hands. You may also be wondering, with all this zombie pose stuff, well, okay, so how do the parallel forearms come into play with all this? Well, okay, in this context, imagine that you're yanking a garden hose around the corner of a house. So you've got a spigot on one side of your house, and perhaps your garden is around the other side. And you're yanking the garden hose around the house. And you know how the garden hose kind of rasps against the corner of the house as you're pulling it around the side of the house? Yeah, it so happens that the same thing happens to your finger ligaments against the bones in your wrists if your wrists aren't straight. So that is to say that if you imagine you have your hand, you've got all the ligaments in your hand and they go down to your wrists in this way. But if your wrists are tilted inward, then these ligaments now have to go around this corner here. And what they end up doing is these ligaments end up rubbing against the bones in your wrist if your wrists aren't straight. So that's kind of one of the main downsides to typing with the like if your wrists are not straight. So all in all, taking into context the zombie pose, from a top-down view, your forearms should be close to parallel and your wrists should be straight. And what that means is that in most cases, your hands have to be at least 6 to 9 inches apart when you type, or in metric, about 15 to 23 centimeters. And that's because one of the biggest downsides to traditional keyboards, traditional square, rectangular keyboards, as well as actually to most so-called ergonomic keyboards, is that virtually all of them end up putting a kink in your wrists because they place your hands too close together. So you might imagine if your hands are too close together, you might have to bow your arms outward like this, but that ends up putting a kink in your wrist this way. So that is one of the I would say the chief downside to traditional keyboards, as well as to actually most so-called ergonomic keyboards. But getting back to Helvetica for a moment, another tip that we can draw from its design is that the Helvetica principle actually applies to your eye line too. And as that goes, the top of your screen should be about 2 to 3 inches above your eye line when you're looking straight ahead. So 2 to 3 inches would be about 5 to 8 centimeters. And the reason for that is that for humans, we can look up a bit without much strain. We can look down somewhat without much strain. But if supposing that you're working at your desk on your laptop, if your head is down like this, that's going to create strain in your neck. So what really works best when it comes to either your laptop screen or an external monitor is to aim to have the top of the screen about 2 to 3 inches or about 5 to 8 centimeters above your eye line when you're looking straight ahead. But you know what? In addition to these ergonomic tips, there are also some ergonomic traps that you may run into. Some things that may seem like friends, but may turn out to be foes. And the first of which is that a lot of keyboards have those little legs that let you raise the back of the keyboard. But it turns out that tilting the back of the keyboard up just tends to make things worse. And that's because raising the back of your keyboard creates a kink in your wrists. And that means that you're right back at the ligaments rasping against the bones in your wrists. So if you imagine this way, if the back of your keyboard is tilted upward, you've got a kink right here, which then the ligaments, as they go through your wrist, end up rubbing against the bones in your wrist in that way. Moving on from there, you may also have come across wrist rests. But it so happens that wrist rests actually put pressure on the very parts of our wrists that the ligaments in our hands funnel through. So that is to say that you've got your hand, you've got all these ligaments funneling through, and a wrist rest tends to land right about here, which is exactly where all these ligaments are. And so a wrist rest ends up putting pressure right on those ligaments. But with that being said, if you'd like to rest your hand against something while you type, you might try looking for a keyboard with palm rests. And that's because there's actually plenty of meat in our palms, and they tend to be much better for bearing the weight of our hands. And later on, I'll actually show a couple of keyboards that have some palm rests built in. And similarly, if you like to rest your hand against something when you're using a mouse, you might go for a mouse that's large enough that you can place your whole palm on it. So for instance, here's a mouse. This happens to be a Contour Unimouse. And you can see how I can place my whole hand on it. And in that way, it gives me something that acts similarly to a wrist rest without putting that pressure right on this part of the wrist. And that actually brings us to this section where I want to talk about some gear that can help. And just to say, even though I'll be mentioning a few products here, I have no affiliation with any of these companies. So I just happen to like their stuff, and I thought I'd mention a few highlights. So the first of which is that there's the Kinesis Advantage 2, which is this sort of weird looking keyboard here. And this is one keyboard that actually includes wrist rests, where you can see those sort of gray areas just in front of the keys, and that's where one can rest wrists. So among some of the things that I like about this keyboard, the first of which is that it keeps your hands pretty close to shoulder width apart. So you've got those two bowls of keys, and your hands are pretty much right around that 6 to 9 inches apart, or 15 to 23 centimeters. So that's a good thing. On top of that, this keyboard helps you maintain a handshake position. As being able to see, it has those two bowls that kind of curve upward. And in doing so, that places your hands right in that handshake position. And then as well, this keyboard also pairs your strongest muscles in your hands, which are your thumbs. It pairs your thumbs with the keys that you use most. So, for example, most people use space and backspace quite a lot. On a traditional keyboard, space is very easy to reach, but backspace is off in the corner on your pinky. But with this keyboard, under your right thumb is space, under your left thumb is backspace. Similarly, there's also Enter right near your right thumb and Delete right near your left thumb. And just to add, this keyboard has actually been my daily keyboard for about 20 years. And I credit this keyboard with being the reason that I can type throughout an entire workday without aches and pains. This keyboard and keyboards like it can really make a difference. Moving on to another keyboard that I quite like is the Ergonomics EZ, which actually shares some things in common with the Kinesis Advantage that I was showing just earlier. When it comes to this keyboard, some of the things I like are that it lets you place your hands as far apart as you'd like, because the two halves are actually completely separate. So not only can you place them just a little bit apart, you can have them as far apart as you'd like to. On top of that, this keyboard also supports what's called tenting as well as negative tilt. Now tenting, if you imagine if you're going camping and you have a tent, so that triangle shape, that's the shape that tenting refers to. And that describes when a keyboard has controls that let you tilt up the middle. And this allows you to get that handshake position. And then perhaps similarly, there's negative tilt, which is just the opposite of the way that keyboards, or some keyboards, tilt up at the back. So instead of tilting up the back, this keyboard actually tilts downward a bit, or at least has the option to. And one upside to that is that you can, in some cases, actually get a straighter wrist path depending on how your desk height and keyboard may be set up. And then lastly, much like the Kinesis Advantage, with the Ergonomics EZ, you can also pair your strongest muscles with the keys that you use most. So you can see in this example how you have those thumb areas where you can have backspace, space, and so on. And much like the Kinesis, this keyboard also comes with palm rests. In the picture here, palm rests are the two sort of white blocks that are just below the keys. Moving on to mice, one that I think is quite good is the volume vertical mouse, which I also have an example of here. And among some of the things that this has going for it are that it maintains a handshake position. So for instance, when you're grabbing this mouse, you get basically that handshake position automatically. As well, this mouse also comes in wired or wireless versions, whichever you might prefer. And look, it's a mouse. How many bullet points do you really need here? But moving on to another mouse that you might consider, there's the Contour Unimouse, which I had showed earlier. And with this mouse, some of the things that I like about it are that it also maintains a handshake position. So when your hand's on it, you get that handshake position. But then as well, this mouse also lets you adjust the tilt to your liking. So for instance, if maybe you want a little bit less tilt, you can tilt it downward. If you want a bit more tilt, you can increase the tilt this way. It kind of just works to whichever might strike your fancy. Now, personally, of these two mice, the one that I use every day is the volume vertical mouse, which is this one that I was showing just earlier. But with that being said, a lot of this comes down to just your own physiology. And so one mouse that I might prefer might not be the same mouse that you might prefer. And that's okay. Moving on, another product that I also quite like, as well as, in addition to mice, is that of laptop stands, which can help you place your laptop screen at a height that's more suitable. One that I think is quite good is the Roost laptop stand. But you know what? There are other laptop stands out there. I'm not going to pretend like this is the only one. But as this one goes, one thing that, of course, it does is it places your screen at eye level, which is kind of just the one thing that laptop stands are really best at. But on top of that, this one also lets you adjust the height to your liking. So in contrast, some laptop stands may have just a fixed height, whereas this one offers an adjustable height depending on maybe you're a little taller, maybe you're a little shorter. Either way works. And then one other upside is that this laptop stand, which I actually have right here, one nice thing about it is that it collapses for travel. So imagine, for instance, that you're working at a coffee shop for a day, or perhaps you're on a business trip. You don't want some big bulky thing in your bag. But what's nice about this one is that when you get to the end of the day, it just collapses into one of these things. And this doesn't take up very much room at all in your luggage. So that's also just another nice thing. But you know what? It's time for some real talk here. And you know those keyboards I was mentioning earlier, the Kinesis Advantage 2, the Ergonomics EZ? Yeah, those go for about $300 a piece. And I know that ain't cheap. On top of that, you might be saying to yourself, you know, do I really need to worry about this? I feel fine. But you know what? You might think of it this way. You know, how would you feel if you met a 30 or 40 or 50-year-old colleague who smoked a pack a day and who said to you, you know, do I really need to worry about all this? I feel fine. And yeah, we've all heard of that one guy who smoked a pack a day and lived to be 100. But that one guy's story doesn't mean that smoking a pack a day is harmless. And similarly, you might likewise know of some older colleagues who haven't done any ergonomic planning, but they can type without issues. But you know what? Their good fortune doesn't mean that we're all going to be that lucky. So really, at the end of the day, ask yourself this. How much is it worth to me to be able to continue typing for a living? Because that's what it really comes down to. That, yeah, there may be some of us who might be able to get by without ergonomic planning, and maybe you'll be okay when you're 70 or 80 or 90 years old. But in this genetic lottery, there's no way of really knowing which of those groups you're going to be in. So I think it really pays to put in an ounce of prevention, maybe even 2 or 3 ounces of prevention, just to give ourselves the best chances of being able to type as long into our golden years as we might like to. So let's recap what we talked about today. First off, be sure to keep your forearms and thighs parallel to the floor when you're typing. And secondly, you should really be typing with your hands at least 6 to 9 inches apart, or in metric about 15 to 23 centimeters. And that's to avoid that kink in our wrists, when your wrists end up being kinked. As well, you should also use a keyboard and mouse that lets you maintain that handshake position. Because in as much as many keyboards are perfectly flat, if you recall from earlier with that zombie exercise, if you actually try to hold your hands out in front of you, perfectly flat, you'll probably start to feel some strain along your inner forearms because our hand's natural position isn't to be perfectly flat. And as well, you should place your monitor or laptop screen so that the top of the screen is about 2 to 3 inches or about 5 to 8 centimeters above eye level. And then, just to round things out, don't use wrist rests. They can really be kind of a false friend when it comes to ergonomics. If anything, you might try using palm rests. So, that brings me to the close of my talk. If you might like to, all of my slides are available online at bit.ly/ergoslides. As well, going back to Arial and Helvetica for a moment, if you might be interested in trying out some alternative typefaces other than Arial, if you might be interested in perhaps moving away from Arial for some of your documents, it so happens that there are actually a bunch of typefaces that are already installed in your computer that are way better than Arial. And if you might like to learn about some of those, you can go to bit.ly/systemfonts, and you can see a bunch of great alternatives to Arial. As well, if you might be interested in sort of the history of Arial, I can totally vouch for this fantastic article by typographer Mark Simonson on the history of Arial, and you can get to that at bit.ly/thescourgeofarial. And then lastly, if you might like to get in touch, I'm on Twitter, and you can reach me at Friendly Ashley, where I tweet about language, or I'm also at Hand Coding, where I tweet about accessibility. And I realize that we've covered quite a fair bit of ground here. And yeah, this might take a little bit of time to sink in, but you know what? If you have some questions about ergonomics, if maybe you're looking at some keyboards and you're like, is this one a good option? Is this a good option? You know what? If you have any questions like that, feel free to tweet me. Go right ahead. I'm happy to help out. And that brings us to the close of this. Thank you for checking this out, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.